Have you ever watched a cartoon that was so obviously made for kids? Bright colors, silly voices, absurd logic, and then suddenly, mid-episode, felt this cold, creeping feeling that whoever wrote this wasn't talking to the children in the room at all? That whoever sat down at that writing desk had a very specific, very adult point to make, and they wrapped it in candy-colored animation, because that was the only way anyone would actually let them say it. That's the amazing world of Gumball. And if you haven't felt that feeling while watching it, this video is going to rewrite a lot of your memories of this show. So get comfortable, settle in, let the lights stay low, and your breathing stay slow. If you're already in bed, you're already winning. And if you want more of this, long, quiet, deep dives into the cartoons that shaped how we think, then subscribing to Cortoon takes about 3 seconds, and it means we can keep doing this together. Alright, let's go. Here's a question that I want you to sit with for a second, and you don't even have to answer it out loud. You can just let it drift around in your head while you close your eyes a little. The question is this: when was the last time a piece of media made you genuinely laugh at something you also felt ashamed of? Not embarrassed because the joke was crude ashamed, but ashamed because the joke was about you, about something you do, or believe, or participate in, and the show just put it on the screen and said, yeah, we see you. We all see you. The amazing world of Gumball did this constantly. For 11 years, from 2011 to 2019, it aired on Cartoon Network, and it said things that most adult dramas won't say. It satirized social media years before social media satire became fashionable. It made fun of consumer culture in ways that would have been cutting in a prestige TV comedy. It interrogated internet behavior, media literacy, content creation, political correctness, and the hollow promises of capitalism. And it did all of this through a blue cartoon cat and his goldfish brother, who somehow has legs. So tonight, we're going to go through it, slowly, thoroughly, letting each piece breathe. We're going to talk about 8 specific episodes or concepts: the internet, the console, the intelligence, the menu, the blame, the uploads, the news, and the boredom. And by the time we're done, you're going to have a completely different relationship with this show, or you'll be asleep, which is also a perfectly valid outcome. Either way, I hope it's a good night. Let's start at the very beginning of what makes Gumball so unusual as a piece of media, because I think we need to establish the foundation before we start pulling specific threads. Gumball was created by Ben Bocquelet, a French animator who had originally designed some of the characters as failed commercial mascots, things he'd pitched to advertising clients that got rejected. So he took these sad, unwanted little characters and built a world around them. And that origin story matters because it immediately tells you something about what the show was interested in. It was interested in things that don't quite fit, things that are sold to us and rejected, things that exist in the gap between what we're promised and what we get. The show is set in the town of Elmore, which is a suburb that operates on cartoon logic, meaning anything can happen and the show can comment on anything. The main characters are Gumball Watterson, a 12-year-old blue cat, and his family. Darwin, his adopted goldfish brother, who grew legs and became fully sentient. Aeneas, his terrifyingly intelligent 4-year-old sister. Nicole, his mother who is barely holding everything together and is kind of incredible. And Richard, his father, who is a large pink rabbit who has never had a job and is, in the most loving possible reading, a representation of weaponized comfort. The supporting cast includes literally every kind of animated character you can imagine. CGI renders, 2D cartoons, puppets, live-action cutouts, watercolor paintings, characters who look like clip art from a 1990s educational software program. The visual diversity of the show is not random. It's doing something. Every time the show introduces a character who looks slightly wrong, slightly off, slightly like something you'd find in a forgotten folder on an old computer, that's intentional. The show is constantly making you aware that you are watching something constructed. That artifice is everywhere. And once you start noticing that, you start noticing everything else. Now, the way Gumball works as satire is different from how most satires work. Most satire comes at you directly. It takes something real, exaggerates it until it's absurd, and then asks you to feel clever for recognizing the exaggeration. Gumball does something more uncomfortable than that. Gumball takes something real, renders it as completely and accurately as possible, puts cartoon characters in the middle of it, and then just lets it run. And what's uncomfortable about that is that sometimes the cartoon characters make it worse. Sometimes they're complicit. Sometimes Gumball is the problem. And the show knows it. That's the show's greatest trick, I think. Most satirical cartoons let you off the hook. They show you the bad thing being done by the bad person, and you get to feel righteous about it. Gumball regularly puts the bad thing in your hands, and it does it while being very funny. And when you're laughing, you're not quite sure if you're laughing because the joke is clever, or because you recognize yourself in it. And that uncertainty is the whole point. Let me give you a concrete example of this before we go any further, because I think it grounds everything that follows. There's a moment in the show, and I'm keeping this deliberately vague so as not to spoil it if you haven't seen it, where Gumball does something casually unkind. Not dramatically unkind. Not villain unkind. Casually unkind. The kind of small, offhand cruelty that barely registers when it happens. And the show watches the consequences of that small cruelty ripple outward. And the consequences are larger than you'd expect. And the show doesn't punish Gumball for it in any heavy-handed way. It just shows you. It shows you what that kind of casual unkindness costs. And you recognize it because you've done it. Not the exact thing, but the shape of it. The shape of it is very recognizable. And that's the feeling I want you to hold on to as we go through this. The shape of recognition. The feeling of seeing yourself in a blue cartoon cat and not being entirely comfortable with what you see. All right, let's talk about the internet. Season 2 of Gumball contains an episode called The Internet, and it aired in 2013, so 2013. That's more than a decade ago now. And I want you to hold that in your head, because what this episode depicts is so precisely what we live with today that watching it now feels less like watching an old cartoon and more like watching footage of a rehearsal. The premise: Gumball accidentally posts an embarrassing video of himself online. The video goes viral. The internet responds. And what happens next is not that Gumball finds a way to take the video down, or that his friends help him manage the situation. What happens is that the internet immediately and completely destroys him. Not metaphorically, actually destroys him. The video spreads faster than he can track. People remix it. They add music to it. They post it in contexts he didn't intend and couldn't anticipate. And then, crucially, people who have no connection to Gumball, people who don't know him at all, people who are not even in the same demographic as him, start using the video to have conversations that have nothing to do with him. He becomes a meme. He becomes a vessel for other people's feelings. And here's the part that hits different in 2026. The show doesn't play this for horror. It plays it for comedy, because the comedy and the horror are the same thing. The joke is that the internet is completely out of his control. The joke is that there is no recourse. The joke is that the thing spiraling away from him is not even really about him anymore. It's about everyone else's relationship to the idea of him. And watching that as a kid in 2013 might have been funny in a kind of abstract way. Watching that now, after everything we've experienced with viral culture and main character syndrome, and the way a single moment can define a person's public existence indefinitely, it's extraordinary. The episode also does something that I want to spend some time on because I don't think it gets enough credit. It shows you the people making the comments. It shows you the anatomy of an internet pile-on. And what it shows is that the people piling on are not villains in any conventional sense. They're not malicious. They're bored. They're procrastinating. They're doing what people do when they're given infinite content to consume and a feedback mechanism that rewards engagement. The show doesn't moralize about this. It just shows it. And that restraint is what makes it land. There's a tangent I want to take here. Actually, tangents are kind of mandatory in this format. I feel like I should just acknowledge that up front. If I go somewhere unexpected, just follow me, and we'll get back to where we were. The tangent is this. There's a theory in media studies about what's sometimes called parasocial substitution, which is the idea that as people's real social lives become more fragmented and isolating, they fill the gap with parasocial relationships, not just with celebrities, but with online figures, fictional characters, even brands. And one of the symptoms of this is a kind of ownership feeling. People feel like they have a genuine stake in the public person they follow. And when that person does something the audience doesn't like, the response is personal, betrayed feeling. That's what's happening to Gumball in this episode. The people commenting on his video don't feel like they're doing anything wrong because they have a relationship with the content, even if they have no relationship with the person. The show was depicting this in 2013, before TikTok, before the cancel culture discourse became a full-time media industry, before we developed the vocabulary we now have for talking about these dynamics. Gumball just showed it to us, dressed it in blue fur, and called it comedy. Now let me talk about something the episode does visually that reinforces all of this. The art style shifts when Gumball enters the internet. The show becomes even more visually fragmented. You get different animation styles layered on top of each other, text appearing and disappearing. The kind of chaos of information that we now associate with doom scrolling, but which in 2013 was still mostly metaphorical for most viewers. Now it's literal. Now when you watch that sequence, it looks exactly like being on your phone. And I'm not sure whether that's because the show is prescient or because our phones have caught up to the cartoon's nightmare vision. I lean toward the second interpretation. I think Gumball imagined a world, and then the world became it. Something I also want to highlight about the internet episode that often goes unnoticed is the way the show depicts the speed of the thing. Not just that the video spreads, but how fast it spreads. The speed is inhuman. The speed is faster than Gumball can think, faster than he can react, faster than any individual human response can be formulated. And the show renders this with visual acceleration. Things are literally moving faster on screen during the viral sequence. The frame rate changes. The editing changes. And this is the show communicating something that is genuinely hard to put into words. The experience of being inside a viral moment is an experience of temporal displacement. You're no longer moving at the speed of your own experience. You're moving at the speed of the platform, and the platform is always faster than you. I've talked to people who've had things go viral. Not massive, mainstream viral, just medium-sized internet viral. And the thing they all describe is this sense of not being able to keep up with their own story. The narrative about them was being written faster than they could read it, much less respond to it. And that experience, which was relatively rare in 2013 when the episode aired, is now something that happens to ordinary people with notable regularity. The conditions for a medium-sized viral moment have never been easier to stumble into, and Gumball saw that coming. Okay, let's shift to the console. This one is a fan favorite for very different reasons. In this episode, Gumball comes across a role-playing game cartridge, and the whole world of Elmore transforms into an RPG. And on the surface, this is a love letter to video game tropes. It's got the combat systems, the dialogue trees, the fetch quests, the level up mechanics, all the stuff that anyone who's played JRPGs will immediately recognize and feel warm about. But underneath that love letter is something more interesting. The RPG mechanics don't just affect Gumball's experience. They infect the entire town. The residents of Elmore suddenly have stats and hit points and dialogue options. They become gamified. And the show starts asking, in the way it always asks things, which is by just depicting them and letting you do the math. What does it actually feel like to live in a world that has been reduced to its mechanics? What does it mean when everything has a score? This is a question that was extremely speculative when the episode aired and is now simply a description of contemporary reality. Gamification is everywhere. Your credit score is a number that determines your access to housing. Your social media metrics determine your visibility. Your health app gives you rings to close and achievements to unlock. Your dating profile has an engagement score that affects who sees it. Your Uber rating exists. There is almost no domain of modern life that has not been gamified in some way. And the question the show is asking, what does this do to you, to the way you see other people, to the way you make decisions, is not a hypothetical anymore. The episode has a moment where Gumball, playing within the RPG logic, exploits a non-player character for resources. He does it because the game says he can. The NPC responds in a way that suggests they're experiencing something, and Gumball is briefly uncomfortable, but the game mechanics reassert themselves and he moves on. It's played for laughs. It's also a fairly precise depiction of what we've learned about how people behave in anonymized, gamified digital environments. The rule system replaces the conscience. If the system says this is valid, it's valid. And the people who get hurt by that are the ones the system doesn't count. I keep coming back to the visual language here, because Gumball's visual language is doing so much heavy lifting throughout the whole show. When the world becomes an RPG, the background changes. It gets simplified, flattened, turned into something that looks like a tile map. And the characters in the foreground start to look wrong against that background. They don't belong in the simplified world. There's a visual dissonance between the complexity of the characters and the flattened, optimized world they're now moving through. And I think that's the show telling you. The gamified world can't actually hold you. You're too complicated. You'll always overflow the grid. Let me take a small drift here. I can't help it. To the broader question of what video games mean as a cultural reference point in a show like this. Gumball came out during a period when gaming was transitioning from a subculture to a mainstream cultural dominant. In 2011, when the show started, gaming was still coded as a somewhat niche interest. By 2019, when the show ended, gaming was the largest entertainment industry in the world, and the cultural vocabulary of games had completely infiltrated everything from corporate management to social media design to political organizing. The show tracked this transition in real time. The console is from early in the show's run, and it's treating games as a metaphor. By the later seasons, the show was treating digital culture as the reality, and the physical world as the metaphor. That's a shift in perspective that mirrors what actually happened to society between 2011 and 2019. The show is almost a documentary of that shift, if you're willing to squint at it in the right light. There's something else the console episode is doing that I find genuinely clever, and that connects to a much larger point about how RPGs as a genre relate to agency. In most RPGs, you feel like you're making choices. You feel like you're the author of your character's story. You're selecting dialogue options, choosing your path through the world, deciding who to help and who to fight. The illusion of agency is core to the experience. But the console episode keeps revealing the limits of that agency in ways that are uncomfortable. Gumball tries to make choices that fall outside the game's decision tree, and the game just rejects them. There's no option for the thing he wants to do. The dialogue options don't include a response that reflects what he actually feels. He's choosing between things, but the things he's choosing between were all predetermined by someone else. And that, if you extend it beyond the literal video game context, is a fairly elegant depiction of consumer choice. You can choose between 37 pasta sauces, but you didn't choose that those were the options. You didn't choose that this is what a grocery store is. You didn't choose the context in which your choice is being made. The choice happens inside a container designed by someone else, and the container shapes the choice more than the choice itself does. Gumball in the RPG is choosing from a dialogue tree he didn't write. You in the grocery store are choosing from a shelf you didn't stock. These are structurally the same situation. Now we get to the intelligence, which is the episode that I personally think is the show at its most precise and most brutal about something that matters enormously. The intelligence is about social media. Specifically, it's about what happens to Gumball when he creates an online persona, and the gap between who he presents himself as and who he actually is. The episode takes him through the full life cycle of a social media arc. The initial excitement of creating the persona, the dopamine hit of early engagement, the pressure to maintain and escalate the persona as the audience grows, the moment where maintaining the persona requires him to act against his actual values, and then the collapse. That life cycle is not exaggerated in the episode. That's the thing. The show doesn't make it cartoonishly extreme. It shows it at exactly the speed and scale that it happens to real people. And because it's showing it to children, who are the exact demographic who is in the middle of this cycle right now, who are building identities online right now, who are experiencing exactly the pressure the show is describing right now, the fact that it depicts it so accurately without ever being preachy or moralistic about it is genuinely impressive. The show's critique of social media is not that social media is bad. That would be a lazy critique, and Gumball doesn't do lazy critiques. The show's critique is that social media creates a structural incentive toward inauthenticity, and that this incentive is not visible to the people experiencing it while they're experiencing it. Gumball doesn't decide to be fake. He drifts into fakeness because the feedback system rewards the fake version, and the real version doesn't play as well. And that drift is not a failure of character. It's a response to an incentive structure. The show knows the difference between those two things, which is more than most adult media does. There's a scene in this episode that I want to describe in a little detail because I think it's doing something subtle. Gumball is looking at his metrics, the number of reactions, the comments, the shares, and the show presents these numbers not as a source of joy, but as a kind of pressure. The numbers are always climbing, which means the expectation is always climbing, which means the next piece of content has to be better, more engaging, more extreme. And Gumball is making decisions not based on what he wants to share, but based on what the numbers are telling him the audience wants. He's no longer the author of his own story. He's the performer in someone else's. That's the machine. That's what the attention economy actually does. And the show is showing it to kids who are either about to enter that machine or who are already in it. And it's saying, look at what this looks like from the outside. Look at how small the person becomes inside the mechanism. And it's not saying don't use social media. It's saying know what you're inside. Be able to see the walls. Here's my tangent for this section, and it's one I've been thinking about for a while. There's a philosopher named Byung-Chul Han who writes about what he calls the Achievement Society, which is his term for a culture that has replaced external coercive discipline, someone telling you what to do, with internalized coercive pressure, where you tell yourself what to do, and the pressure comes from inside. His argument is that this makes people more productive in the short term and more psychologically damaged in the long term, because there's no one to rebel against. The oppression is yourself. And I think Gumball is depicting exactly this in The Intelligence. Gumball is not being forced to perform. He's choosing to perform because the machine has colonized his choices. He is simultaneously the oppressor and the oppressed. And the show depicts this in a cartoon for children in 22 minutes. I find that astonishing. I genuinely do, every time I think about it. But let me keep going with The Intelligence for a bit longer, because there's a dimension I haven't fully explored yet, which is what the episode shows about the audience side of social media. Because the show is interested in both sides of the transaction. It's interested in what the persona does to the person maintaining it, but it's also interested in what the persona does to the people consuming it. The followers Gumball accumulates in the episode are not passive. They're active participants in the construction of the persona. They reward certain things. They encourage certain directions. They express preferences that Gumball then responds to. And in this way, they're partially responsible for what the persona becomes. Not because they're forcing him to do anything, but because their collective response is a force that shapes his decisions. The followers are not innocent bystanders. They're collaborators in the process of hollowing him out. This is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the social media critique in the episode. Most critiques of social media focus on the platform, the algorithm, the design choices, the business model, and those are real targets. But Gumball is also looking at the demand side, at us, at the people who click and like and share and comment, whose aggregate behavior creates the pressure that the performers are responding to. We are not outside the machine. We are the machine. And the show knows it, and it tells us so, gently, through the medium of a cartoon cat. Alright, the menu. This is the consumerism episode, and it's one of the most layered things the show ever did. The premise is deceptively simple. The family goes to a restaurant, but the restaurant has an infinite menu. The menu is so large that there is always another option, always another choice available, always a better version of what you ordered that you could have had if you just looked a little further. And the family becomes paralyzed. They cannot order. They are stuck in a loop of consideration, comparison, and deferral. This is a direct, unambiguous depiction of what behavioral economists call the paradox of choice, the well-documented psychological finding that more options produce less satisfaction, not more. When you have a small menu, you pick something and you eat it, and you're probably fine. When you have an infinite menu, you spend so much cognitive energy on the decision that whatever you eventually choose arrives tasting like anxiety. You wonder about the dishes you didn't order. You feel the ghost of the better meal you might have had. Now expand that beyond a restaurant. Expand it to every consumer choice in a market that has been optimized for the illusion of infinite variety. Your streaming service has 40,000 pieces of content. Your grocery store has 37 varieties of pasta sauce. Your phone has 2 million apps. Your dating app has an algorithmically curated infinite scroll of potential partners. Every domain of modern consumer life has been turned into an infinite menu. And the result, documented by psychologists and reported in 100 hand-wringing think pieces, is exactly what happens to the Wattersons. Paralysis, dissatisfaction, and the persistent feeling that the good choice is somewhere just beyond the one you made. The episode extends this further by introducing the restaurant management structure, and this entity is absolutely delighted by the family's paralysis. Because a paralyzed customer is a customer who stays. A customer who stays is a customer who spends. The restaurant's business model depends not on the customers being satisfied, but on the customers being perpetually, productively uncertain. And if you recognize that as a description of how most digital platforms operate, they're not trying to give you what you want. They're trying to keep you wanting. They're trying to prolong the seeking behavior. Then you're starting to see what the show is doing. The menu is also, and I want to be clear that this reading is intentional and not something I'm projecting onto the show, a critique of the way consumer capitalism promises individuality and delivers conformity. The menu has infinite items, but the ingredients are all the same. Every option, when you examine it, is a recombination of the same elements. The diversity is a surface property. Underneath, everything comes from the same place. And I don't think it's an accident that this is how the show depicts the restaurant, because it's exactly how the show elsewhere depicts Elmore itself. The town looks varied. The characters look different from each other. But the social pressures, the economic logic, the emotional dynamics, they're all the same. Uniformity dressed as variety. That's the critique. Let me drift for a moment to talk about what Ben Bacalé and the writing team seem to be reading and watching, because the cultural fluency in this show is genuinely remarkable. The satire of consumerism in Gumball doesn't feel like it was assembled from obvious reference points. It feels like it was written by people who understood the theoretical underpinnings of consumer culture. People who had engaged with writers like Veblen and Baudrillard and Naomi Klein and the long tradition of anti-consumerist critique. And then those people translated that understanding into situations involving a blue cat and his goldfish brother. And somehow it works. Somehow it works better than a lot of the books do, because the abstraction is gone and the feeling is right there. That's actually one of the things that's always fascinated me about animation as a medium. It has this ability to take a complex idea and locate it in a body and a face and a moment. And that relocation from the abstract to the specific changes how the idea lands. When you read about the paradox of choice in a psychology textbook, it's interesting. When you watch a cartoon cat stare at a menu in helpless, spiraling indecision while his family falls apart around him, it's funny and sad and completely true. And you feel all three of those things at once, and you take that feeling home with you. I also want to spend a moment on how the menu depicts time, because time is part of what the episode is about. The family spends what should be a brief dinner out becoming a multi-hour ordeal, then a multi-day one, and then, in the kind of compressed, absurdist escalation that Gumball does better than almost any show, potentially a multi-year one. The time cost of infinite choice is part of the episode's argument. We think that more options save us time because we can optimize our choice. But in reality, more options cost us time because the decision process itself has a time cost that scales with the number of options. And beyond a certain number of options, the decision process takes longer than any possible benefit from finding the theoretically optimal choice. The math works against you. The infinite menu is not saving you time. It is eating your time. And the episode makes this literal in ways that are hilarious and genuinely a little unnerving. Now let's talk about The Blame. The Blame is the censorship episode, and it might be the bravest episode the show ever made. It aired in 2016, and the context matters. 2016 was the year that the discourse around content moderation, trigger warnings, cultural sensitivity, and what certain critics were calling political correctness reached a particularly high pitch. This discourse was happening from every direction. There were people arguing that content needed to be more carefully controlled to protect vulnerable audiences. And there were people arguing that content control was a form of cultural suppression. And both sides were frequently arguing past each other using increasingly charged vocabulary. And into this, Gumball walked the blame. The premise: the parents of Elmore Elementary conclude that video games are responsible for the bad behavior of children. They move to ban video games. The ban is absurd and overreaching. The logic is circular and unfalsifiable. Any evidence against the theory is interpreted as more evidence for it. The adults refuse to engage with counter-arguments. They're not interested in evidence. They've decided. And here's where the show does something that, depending on your position, is either brilliantly balanced or deeply uncomfortable. It does not mock only the parents who are trying to ban the games. It also depicts the children, including Gumball, as responding to the censorship attempt in ways that are not entirely sympathetic. The children are also not engaging with the argument in good faith. They're motivated by self-interest. They want to play their games, and they'll construct whatever argument is handy. The show refuses to let anyone be right. This is, I think, what drew the most critical attention to this episode when it aired, and it's what makes it worth spending time on. Because the show is doing something very careful. It's distinguishing between the question of whether censorship is good and the question of why people argue for or against it. The parents' argument is bad. The children's counter-argument is also largely self-serving. And the show is suggesting that the reason we so often fail to have productive conversations about content and harm and responsibility is that almost nobody involved is actually motivated by the stated principles. Everyone is motivated by something more immediate and more personal. That's a brutal critique. It's brutal because it's aimed at everyone simultaneously, and the show delivers it through a plot about video games and elementary school parents. So it lands with almost no friction. You're laughing, you're nodding, and then you realize it's talking about the conversation you had on social media last Tuesday. The episode also has something to say about the relationship between media and behavior that I want to tease out a little, because it's more subtle than it might appear. The show doesn't conclude that video games definitely don't cause harm. It concludes that the proposed mechanism is wrong, and the proposed solution is wrong. These are different conclusions. You can believe that certain media has certain effects without believing that moral panic and censorship are the appropriate response. The show holds both of these possibilities open at the same time, and it does so without ever stating either of them explicitly. It just depicts a situation in which the moral panic is clearly counterproductive, and the people pushing back on it are clearly not entirely motivated by noble principles. And then it ends, and you get to sit with the complexity. I want to take a tangent here about the history of this kind of moral panic in entertainment history because I think the context makes the blame even more interesting. Video games are the most recent iteration of a very long tradition. In the 1950s, it was comic books. Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent was a bestseller that argued comic books were corrupting children and contributing to juvenile delinquency, and the resulting moral panic led to the Comics Code Authority, which restricted the content of American comics for decades and arguably stunted the development of the medium. Before that, it was radio. Before that, it was novels. Before that, it was theater. Every generation has a new technology that adults are convinced is destroying the minds of the young, and every generation of young people grows up and looks back at that panic with bewilderment. Gumball knows this history. You can feel it in the episode. The parents' arguments are not made up. They're lifted almost verbatim from actual arguments made about video games in the 1990s and 2000s. The show is quoting real discourse back at you and asking, does this sound familiar? Does this sound like something we've been through before? Does the fact that we've been through it before tell you anything? And the answer the show implies, not states, implies, is yes. It does tell you something. It tells you that the impulse to protect people from media we don't understand is recurrent and often misguided, and that the things that survive these panics are usually the things that were actually doing something valuable. Comics survived the Comics Code. Video games survived the Senate hearings of 1993. The impulse to control, to restrict, to blame the content rather than the context. That impulse is also still with us. The show isn't saying the impulse is always wrong. It's saying we should be epistemically humble about it. There's also something going on with authority in this episode that I want to name. The adults in Elmore are, on the whole, not portrayed as wiser or more informed than the children. they're portrayed as louder. They have more institutional power. They can actually ban things. They can call meetings. They can invoke school policy, but they're not right more often than the kids are. And in the blame, they're demonstrably less right. What the episode does with this is interesting. It doesn't conclude that authority is therefore worthless, or that adults should always defer to children, or any other symmetrically wrong conclusion. It concludes that authority and correctness are separate things, and that confusing them is dangerous. Authority that isn't grounded in genuine understanding and good faith reasoning is authority that can be captured by moral panics and used for bad ends. The adults in this episode aren't bad people. They're people using authority without the epistemic foundations to wield it responsibly. That's a lesson that Gumball is teaching in 2016 that became, shall we say, more urgently relevant in the years that followed. Let's move to the uploads. This episode is specifically about content creation, about being a YouTuber, about the experience of putting yourself on the internet with the expectation of an audience, and then dealing with what that actually means. In the episode, Gumball and Darwin decide to create an online video series. They have ideas. They have enthusiasm. They have a sincere desire to share something they find interesting. And what happens next is a compressed, accurate, often painful depiction of what the content creation economy actually does to people who enter it. The first thing that happens is discovery. They put something out and people find it, and it feels amazing. This is real. Anyone who has ever made something and shared it online knows this feeling. The first time something connects with people you've never met. It's a specific kind of joy. It's the joy of being heard when you didn't expect it, of reaching someone across a gap you didn't know could be bridged. The second thing that happens is expectation. The audience, now that it exists, begins to exert pressure, not explicit pressure. No one is forcing Gumball and Darwin to do anything, but the implicit pressure of an audience is enormous. You can feel it in the episode. You can see Gumball looking at the comments, parsing what people want, adjusting what he was going to make. The creative impulse starts to bend toward the audience demand. What started as something he wanted to say is slowly becoming something he thinks they want to hear. The third thing is escalation. The audience wants more frequent, more extreme, more of the thing that worked before. The original idea starts to get lost in the optimization for engagement, and Gumball and Darwin start doing things they didn't plan to do, didn't particularly want to do, purely because the machine rewards those things. They're doing stunts they don't find funny. They're performing reactions that aren't genuine. They're making the version of themselves that the metrics like. The fourth thing is exhaustion. The episode shows this clearly. Content creation at any kind of scale, even small fake YouTube channel scale in a cartoon, is a treadmill. You have to keep running or you stop existing in the algorithm. And the treadmill is not getting slower over time. The episode doesn't flinch from this. It shows the treadmill, and then, typically for Gumball, it shows you what the treadmill looks like from the audience's perspective, which is nothing. The audience doesn't see the treadmill. The audience sees content that appears effortlessly. Content that's just there, always, ready to be consumed. The labor is invisible, and the invisibility of the labor is part of what makes the labor unsustainable, because there's no feedback mechanism telling the audience to slow down their consumption to a rate that's actually survivable for the creator. This is a show for children. In a mid-2010s episode, describing something that is now at the center of major cultural conversations about creator burnout, platform exploitation, and the psychological cost of parasocial economies. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic when I say this show was ahead of its time. I'm trying to be accurate. Let me drift to the economics for a moment because I think it adds something. When Gumball and Darwin start their channel, they don't have a monetization model. They're doing it for love, essentially, because they have something they want to share. And the show depicts the moment when money enters the picture, or the promise of money, and how that changes the relationship to the work. Suddenly, the work is not just something you love doing. It's a potential source of income. And once that reframe happens, the relationship to the audience changes. The audience is no longer just people you want to share something with. They're a potential revenue stream, and the relationship to the content changes. The content is no longer just an expression. It's a product. The show doesn't condemn this transition. It just shows it. And what it shows is that the transition is not a betrayal. It's a structural consequence of operating in a context where content creation is simultaneously a creative act and a commercial one. The two motivations coexist, but they pull in different directions, and the tension between them is real and ongoing, and almost nobody talks about it honestly. Almost nobody except this cartoon. I want to also note something the episode does with the comments section specifically, because I think it's worth calling out. The comments in the episode are not uniformly mean. They're not uniformly kind either. They're a mixture of genuine enthusiasm, misplaced criticism, weird non sequiturs, people who are clearly not watching closely, people who are watching very closely indeed, and a specific kind of comment that I find particularly recognizable. The person who is angry that the content didn't meet an expectation they developed themselves without ever communicating it. The entitlement comment. This isn't what I wanted, without any acknowledgement that what you wanted was never promised. The entitlement comment is a specific feature of online content culture that Gumball identifies with great precision. The viewer who feels they have a relationship with the creator and therefore a claim on the creator's output. The viewer who has promoted the content to their own audience and therefore feels they have a stake in what the content does next. These are not imaginary people. These are everywhere on the internet. And the episode shows Gumball reading these comments and being unable to simply dismiss them, because dismissing them would mean dismissing the whole project, and the whole project matters to him. So he absorbs them, and the absorption does something to him that isn't visible in any single comment, but accumulates over time. Now we get to the news, which is the episode I think about most often when I'm reading actual news. The episode depicts a news broadcast in Elmore, and the news broadcast is not fictional in any of the ways that cartoons usually make news fictional. It's not about superheroes or alien invasions or things that could only happen in Elmore. It's about genuinely mundane things. The news is covering things that don't matter, that couldn't possibly be news, with the same tone and visual language and emotional intensity as things that do matter. This is a critique of infotainment, of the way that the 24-hour news cycle, the relentless need for content, the competition for attention, has produced a media landscape in which the form of news, the urgency, the graphics, the authoritative voices, the dramatic music, is completely decoupled from the significance of what's being reported. The container says, "This is important," regardless of whether the contents are important. And viewers, conditioned by the container, respond to everything in the container with the same level of attention and alarm. Which means they don't actually know what's important. The signal and the noise have the same sound. The episode puts this directly in front of the viewer. The news anchor in Elmore reports on things that are obviously trivial with exactly the same gravity as things that are not trivial. And the characters around the TV, the Wattersons, the community, respond to the trivial things with appropriate alarm. They're reacting to the form, not the content. They've been trained by the form. The container is winning. This is such a precise description of media literacy failure that it's almost clinical. And again, cartoon, for children, around the show's mid-run. And it's describing something that has gotten substantially worse since then. The episode would have seemed like an exaggeration when it aired. It now seems like a mild understatement. The episode also addresses something that I think is underappreciated in conversations about media literacy, which is the way that emotional manipulation works in news media. It's not just that news shows trivial things. It's that news shows trivial things in ways specifically designed to produce emotional responses. Because emotional responses drive engagement, sharing, and return viewership. The news is not trying to inform you. The news is trying to feel important to you. These are different goals, and they produce different content. In the episode, the news broadcast is making choices in real time about which stories to lead with, based on which stories produce the strongest audience response. Not the most significant stories, the most emotionally charged ones. And when a genuinely significant story competes for airtime with a trivially emotional one, the trivially emotional one tends to win. Because the trivially emotional one is easier to produce, easier to consume, and produces a more reliable engagement response. This is not speculation. This is documented media economics, and Gumball is showing it to kids. One tangent I want to take here is about the concept of epistemic cowardice in media, which is the idea that media institutions often avoid covering genuinely difficult, complex, or controversial stories, not because they're not newsworthy, but because covering them accurately requires taking positions that will alienate some part of the audience. It's safer to cover something that generates heat without generating genuine controversy, something that feels important without actually requiring anyone to think carefully. The show depicts this dynamic with a precision that makes me think the writers had some direct experience of it. There's also a meta layer here that I find fascinating, which is that a children's cartoon criticizing the news media is itself a piece of media that will be consumed by children who are also consuming news media. The show is teaching media literacy through a medium that is not news media, which sidesteps the problem of news media not being able to teach media literacy about itself. It's a genuinely clever institutional solution. You can't get the fishbowl to describe the water, so you use a different container. The news episode also contains something I want to sit with for a minute. The way it depicts the relationship between the news anchor and the subject of the news. The anchor in the episode is not cruel. The anchor is professional. The anchor is doing their job, which involves taking information about a person or situation and translating it into content that will perform well for an audience. And the translation process inevitably loses things. Things that don't survive the translation into the format. Things that are too complicated, too ambiguous, too resistant to the emotional shorthand that the format requires. And the person or situation being covered loses those things without being asked, without being compensated, without anyone intending them harm. The harm is structural. It's built into the translation process. And the show, by depicting this, is quietly asking whether the translation process is worth what it costs. That's a question that journalism has been trying to answer for a long time. Gumball asked it in a cartoon. And now, finally, we get to the boredom, which is, in my reading, the episode that pulls everything together. The boredom is an episode about what happens when Gumball and Darwin have nothing to do. There's no adventure, no emergency, no quest. It's a day with no structure. And the show watches them not know what to do with that. Watches them reach for their devices. Watches them scroll. Watches the day pass in a fog of passive consumption. And then watches them feel, at the end of it, somehow emptier than when they started. This is a depiction of technology dependence that goes deeper than most technology dependence critiques. Most critiques of technology dependence focus on addiction. They use the language of addiction. They describe the dopamine mechanisms. They tell you that the apps are designed to be compulsive. All of that is true, and the show knows it's true. But the boredom is interested in something slightly different. What technology dependence does to your relationship with yourself. Gumball and Darwin, when they have nothing to do, don't know how to be. They don't know how to sit with themselves. Boredom, which used to be an uncomfortable but ultimately productive state, a state that forced the mind toward creativity, toward interior life, toward genuine engagement with the world, has become intolerable. And it's become intolerable because they always have a way to escape it. The device is always there. The scroll is always there. And because the escape is always available, the uncomfortable but valuable experience of boredom has been optimized out of their lives, and they've lost something in the optimization. The research on this is real. Studies on the relationship between smartphone use and the capacity to tolerate boredom consistently find that high smartphone users have lower tolerance for unstructured time and lower capacity for mind wandering, which is the mental state that underlies creativity, insight, and genuine self-understanding. We're optimizing ourselves out of an experience that was uncomfortable but generative, and the show is watching this happen and not looking away. What makes the episode work as a piece of television, though, and not just as a piece of social commentary, is that it doesn't moralize. It doesn't have a character turn to the camera and say, "You should put down your phone." It just shows you what the day looks like. It shows you the texture of the empty time. It shows you the shape of the absence where boredom used to be. And then it ends, and you're left with the texture and the shape, and what you do with them is up to you. That restraint is Gumball's highest virtue as a show, I think. It has things to say. It says them. It trusts the audience to hear them. I want to return to the boredom episode briefly to make one more observation about it, which is that it ends with Gumball and Darwin doing something genuinely creative. Not something they planned. Not something prompted by a quest or an emergency. Something that comes directly out of the unstructured time. Out of the discomfort of having nothing to do. Out of the experience of being with themselves without a screen between them and their own thoughts. And the creative thing they make is small and imperfect and not really for anyone's consumption. It's just something they made. And the episode frames this as a kind of rescue. As the thing that boredom, if you let it run its course instead of escaping it, can deliver to you. It's a small and very quiet argument. It doesn't hit you over the head, but it's there. The thing that's on the other side of the discomfort is worth the discomfort. The boredom, if you don't flinch from it, turns into something. The show believes this, and it shows it in the faces of two cartoon characters on an ordinary afternoon. I want to take a step back now and talk about the show more broadly, because I've been focusing on individual episodes, and I want to make sure we spend some time on the architecture, the way the whole show is constructed to do what it does. One of the most interesting structural choices the show makes is that Elmore, as a setting, is explicitly a suburb, not a city. Not a rural area, a suburb. And this matters because the suburb is, as a cultural unit, the thing that modern consumer capitalism built for itself. The suburb is what you get when you optimize a human settlement for car ownership, home ownership, and retail spending rather than for community, walkability, or density. The suburb is the spatial expression of a set of values: privacy, individual accumulation, separation from otherness, the single-family home as the basic unit of prosperity, and those values have real consequences for the people who live inside them. The Wattersons live in a suburb that is cartoon absurd, and the cartoon absurdness is partly funny and partly a kind of critique. The houses look the same. The streets look the same. The school exists to prepare children for participation in the economy. The parents work or don't work, depending on what the plot needs. The rhythms of life are the rhythms of consumption. The mall, the grocery store, the restaurant. And the children, Gumball and Darwin and Aeneas, navigate this world with a combination of confusion and adaptation that mirrors how actual children in actual suburbs experience a world that was designed for adults and adult economic behavior, and not for children at all. There's a critique of Richard Watterson lurking in here that I want to surface because I think it's important. Richard is a stay-at-home dad who doesn't do household chores, doesn't discipline the children, doesn't contribute to the family's financial situation, and is consistently depicted as deeply, completely comfortable. He has achieved a level of passive comfort that is, in the show's logic, a kind of failure mode. He is so comfortable that he has stopped being a person in any generative sense. He experiences the world entirely through consumption and passivity. He watches television, he eats. He occasionally causes problems by being impulsive, but even his impulsiveness is a form of comfort seeking. The show loves Richard. He's portrayed with enormous affection, but the show is also very clear that he represents something that has gone wrong. He is what happens when comfort becomes an end in itself rather than a precondition for something. He is the suburb's final form, and placing this character at the center of the family dynamics means that every episode that involves the family is, in some sense, about the consequences of living around this kind of gravitational center of comfortable inertia. Nicole, by contrast, is one of the most interesting characters in the show precisely because she is the load-bearing wall that the whole structure is leaning on. She works. She holds the family together emotionally. She manages the logistics of family life, while also managing her own emotional needs with very limited support. She's brilliant. She's capable. She's occasionally terrifying, and she is not celebrated in the way that her contributions would be celebrated if she were a man. The show is aware of this. There are moments where the show looks directly at what Nicole's life would look like if the distribution of labor in her family were more equitable, and those moments are both funny and quietly devastating. I keep mentioning that things are both funny and devastating, and I want to acknowledge that this combination is the show's signature, and that it's harder to pull off than it looks. It's easy to be funny. It's easy to be devastating. The specific register of both at once, where the laugh and the gut punch arrive simultaneously and you're not sure which feeling to go with, requires a very precise calibration of tone. Gumball calibrates that tone across 8 seasons and hundreds of episodes, and it very rarely slips. When it's at its best, you're laughing, and then you notice what you're laughing about, and the laugh doesn't go away, but something else joins it. A kind of recognition. A kind of discomfort that's not quite guilt and not quite shame, but something adjacent to both. Let me talk for a while about the show's relationship to capitalism specifically, because I think this is where the show's politics, and it does have politics. Everyone who makes something has politics, and pretending otherwise is a kind of dishonesty, become most visible. The show's critique of capitalism is not that capitalism is evil, it's that capitalism is indifferent. The market logic that runs through Elmore doesn't hate anyone. It doesn't have preferences. It just operates. And as it operates, certain things get optimized and other things get crushed. Not because anyone decided to crush them, but because the mechanism doesn't account for them. There's an episode arc involving a business. I don't want to be too specific because the details might spoil the experience for people who haven't seen it, where a new enterprise comes to Elmore promising to improve life in the town. And initially, it does improve things, in measurable ways. Things are cheaper, things are more efficient, things work better. And then, slowly, you see what the efficiency is costing. The local character of things is dissolving. The particular, idiosyncratic, inefficient, but human texture of Elmore is being replaced by something smooth and optimized and faceless. And the town doesn't know how to argue against this, because the argument for it, cheaper, faster, better, is genuinely compelling. This is a story we recognize. This is the story of the big box store that comes to a small town and offers lower prices, and the small businesses close, and the downtown empties, and the money flows out of the local economy to a distant headquarters. This is the story of the platform economy disrupting every industry it touches, creating genuine value for users in the short term, while restructuring labor markets in ways that erode worker protections in the long term. These are stories that don't have simple good guys and bad guys. They have mechanisms. And Gumball is telling these stories through a cartoon about a suburban family because the cartoon can hold the complexity without needing to resolve it. I want to also talk about the show's treatment of education because I think it's doing something interesting that doesn't get discussed much. Elmore Elementary is a school that appears, on the surface, to be a fairly typical cartoon school, but the show is consistently, quietly critical of what the school actually does to children. Not in a broad strokes, teachers are bad way. Most of the teachers are sympathetic characters, and some of them are genuinely good at their jobs. But the institution itself is shown as one whose primary function is not education in any meaningful sense, but socialization into conformity. The children who succeed at Elmore Elementary are the children who figure out how to fit. The children who struggle are the children who are genuinely different, too intelligent, too weird, too creative, too resistant to the normalization. And the school's response to these children is not to adapt to them. It's to wait for them to adapt to the school. The school is a machine for producing people who will be comfortable and non-disruptive inside the social and economic structures that the town represents. This is not a particularly hidden critique. Schools have been described this way by education theorists for decades, from Ivan Illich to John Taylor Gatto to Paulo Freire. But Gumball is doing it while also being a funny show about kids at school, and doing it without ever losing sight of the genuine goods that education can provide. The show doesn't say school is bad. It says this particular version of school, in service of these particular social goals, has some significant costs. And it shows you those costs in the faces of the children who don't quite fit. Gumball himself is one of those children. He's not unintelligent. He's actually quite perceptive. But he's not designed for the school's optimization function. He's too impulsive, too prone to distraction, too interested in things that don't advance the institutional agenda. And his experience of school is a constant negotiation between what he is and what the institution needs him to be. The show finds this genuinely funny. It also finds it genuinely sad. And it holds both of those responses at once without resolving them. I want to spend some time on the show's formal innovations now, because I think the formal dimension is part of the satire and not just an aesthetic flourish. The show, as I mentioned earlier, uses a variety of animation styles. Characters rendered in CG. I coexist with characters rendered in 2D. Hand-drawn animation coexist with characters who look like watercolor paintings. Coexist with characters who look like they were built in Microsoft Word. The backgrounds alternate between photorealistic environments and stylized cartoon worlds. The show is constantly reminding you that it is constructed, that every element of what you're seeing is a choice, that the visual world you're inhabiting is made up. This is a form of what critics call defamiliarization, making the familiar strange so that you can actually see it, rather than just seeing through it. The Russian formalists coined the term ostranение for this, the artistic technique of presenting common things in an unfamiliar way to make the audience perceive the familiar as if for the first time. Gumball uses visual defamiliarization the same way it uses narrative defamiliarization. By making the thing strange, it makes you look at it. By making Elmore look like a collage of incompatible visual styles, it makes you aware that Elmore is a collage of incompatible social pressures and cultural logics. The visual heterogeneity is a map of the social heterogeneity. And when the show wants to make a specific point about a specific kind of cultural experience, it changes its visual language to match. The internet episode looks like the internet. The RPG episode looks like an RPG. The news episode looks like a news broadcast. These are not just cute production choices. They're the show using the visual language of the thing it's satirizing to intensify the critique. You're not just watching a commentary on news media. You're inside the visual grammar of news media while watching the commentary. The medium is not the message exactly, but the medium is amplifying the message, and the show knows it. Let me shift to something I haven't talked about yet, which is the show's treatment of identity and performance. Because the show has a lot to say about this, and it connects to everything we've been discussing. The fundamental thing about living in a modern, media-saturated, socially surveilled environment is that identity becomes performative in ways that it probably wasn't in earlier social configurations, when your social life was primarily conducted face-to-face. With people who knew you over long periods of time, identity had a certain stability. You were who you were, more or less, and the people around you knew who you were, and the performance of identity was mostly unconscious. Now, when significant portions of social life happen online, in front of audiences that are large and anonymous and changeable, identity becomes something you construct actively. You choose what to show, you curate, you edit yourself. Gumball engages with this throughout the show, but most explicitly in episodes where the characters interact with social media or online personas. And what the show consistently finds is that the curation process is costly. Not morally costly. The show doesn't moralize about this. Cognitively costly. The maintenance of a curated identity requires energy, constant monitoring, constant adjustment. And this energy is drawn from somewhere. And what it's drawn from is the more interior, less curated, less performed version of the self. The self that doesn't know it's being watched. The show values the unperformed self. Not in a naive way. It doesn't pretend that the performed self is false, and the unperformed self is true. It knows it's more complicated than that. But it consistently returns to the idea that there's something important about the part of you that exists when there's no audience. And it consistently mourns the erosion of that part under the pressure of the attention economy. The Watterson family, as a unit, is interesting here because it's a family that is mostly not performing for anyone. They're disorganized and loud and frequently embarrassing, and they love each other in a way that is not photogenic. And the show treats this, their messiness, their failure to curate, as a form of health, not as something to be fixed, as something to be protected. I want to spend a moment on the show's depiction of suburban aspirationalism, because it's woven through everything, and it doesn't always get named as a specific target. The suburb, as a social form, runs on aspiration. The aspiration of the better house. The aspiration of the newer car. The aspiration of the better school district. The better neighborhood. The incremental improvement in material conditions that justifies the mortgage and the commute and the absence of character. Aspiration is the fuel that makes the suburban machine run. And the question the show keeps quietly asking is, aspiration toward what Exactly. The Wattersons aspire, sometimes. Nicole aspires to be a better mother, a better worker, a better provider. Gumball aspires to be cooler, more respected, funnier, better liked. Darwin aspires to understand the world. Anais aspires to not be surrounded by people less intelligent than herself, which given the population of Elmore is a tall order. And all of these aspirations are genuine. They're not satirized. The show takes them seriously. But the aspiration that the suburb itself is selling, the aspiration toward comfort, accumulation, and social standing measured in visible goods, that aspiration the show is skeptical of. Not because it thinks comfort is bad, because it thinks comfort sold as an end in itself. Comfort as the culmination of human achievement. Comfort that is purchased rather than earned through any genuine engagement with the difficulty of being alive. That comfort the show regards with something close to pity. Richard Watterson is not a villain, but he is a cautionary tale. He is what happens when the suburb wins, when the aspiration toward comfort is satisfied completely, and there is nothing on the other side. Now let me go through some additional threads the show pulls on that deserve their own treatment, because we've been focused on the 8 main episodes, and there's a whole world of secondary material that's doing similar work. The show has a recurring character who exists in a kind of metatextual space. A character who is aware that they're in a television show. This awareness isn't played for cheap postmodern laughs, though there are some laughs involved. It's used to interrogate the mechanics of storytelling itself. What does it mean to be a character in someone else's story? What kind of agency does a character have when the narrative has already determined where they'll end up? What is the relationship between the story and the person living it? These are questions that connect to the larger themes we've been discussing, because the show is suggesting that the feeling of being a character in someone else's story is not unique to fiction. Living in a consumer culture means having your desires, your aspirations, your sense of what a good life looks like. All of that is partly written for you. The narrative of success is handed to you before you're old enough to question it. The character you're supposed to want to be is modeled for you in advertising, in entertainment, in the aspirational content that saturates your environment. And the question the show is asking through this metatextual character is, are you the author of your story, or are you a character in someone else's? The metatextual character finds this question devastating and funny in equal measure, which is the show's answer, I think. It's devastating because it's real. It's funny because what else can you do? I also want to talk about the Penny and Gumball relationship, not as a romance subplot, but as a thematic vehicle, because I think the show uses it to say something specific about authenticity. Penny, for those who need the reminder, is the character who is, for a large portion of the show, trapped inside a shell that doesn't reflect who she actually is. And the shell is literal. She has a literal external shell that hides her true form. But the metaphor is obvious, and the show is not shy about deploying it. The arc of her character is about learning to exist without the shell, about being seen as she actually is, rather than as the shell that society has decided is an appropriate way for her to present. Gumball's relationship to Penny is, among other things, a story about being the person who sees through the shell, who sees the person and not the presentation. And the show treats this as genuinely, non-trivially difficult. Being seen for who you actually are requires trusting that the person seeing you can handle what they see. It requires vulnerability, and the show depicts the cost and the reward of that vulnerability with more care than you'd expect from a children's cartoon. But it also does something interesting that I want to name. It acknowledges that the shell is not the enemy. The shell exists because the world is not always safe for the real form. The shell is a response to a real environment, not a character flaw. And removing it requires either the environment changing or the person deciding the risk is worth taking. The show takes both of these seriously. That's a lesson about identity and self-presentation that is directly relevant to anyone who presents differently in different contexts. At home versus at work, online versus offline, with friends versus with family. We all have shells. The question is, which shells are protecting us and which shells are imprisoning us? The show doesn't pretend this is an easy question, but it asks it. Now, I want to talk about some of the broader philosophical questions the show is sitting with, because I think they deserve to be named explicitly, even if the show itself only implies them. The first is the question of what freedom actually means in a society that provides you with an enormous number of choices, but constrains the conditions under which you can exercise those choices. This is a classic liberal philosophical question about whether formal freedom is meaningful when substantive freedom is restricted. You are free to choose from the infinite menu. You are not free to not have a menu. You are free to use social media or not use it. But not using it has social costs that are significant enough that the choice is not actually free. You are free to participate in the consumer economy or withdraw from it, but withdrawal has economic and social consequences that make it effectively inaccessible to most people. Gumball doesn't resolve this paradox. No cartoon can resolve this paradox, but it depicts the texture of living inside it with great precision. And sometimes depicting the texture is the most useful thing you can do. It gives you a shared reference point. It gives you a word for the feeling, or rather, it gives you a scene, which is more vivid than a word. The second philosophical question is about the relationship between individual responsibility and systemic pressure. Gumball is often in situations where he does something that turns out to be harmful, and the show is careful about how it assigns responsibility. Sometimes Gumball made a bad choice, and the consequences are his fault, but sometimes Gumball's bad choice was the entirely predictable result of being in a situation that incentivized the bad choice. And in those cases, the show is interested in both the individual and the situation. It doesn't let Gumball off the hook by pointing at the system. But it also doesn't put the full weight on Gumball by pretending the system isn't there. This is a more sophisticated moral framework than you get in most adult dramas, where the protagonist's choices tend to feel fully voluntary because drama requires agency, and agency requires freedom. Gumball is willing to show you a protagonist who is partially constrained, whose choices are shaped by forces he doesn't fully understand and can't fully resist, and who is still accountable for those choices. That's complicated. It's also accurate. The third philosophical question, and this is the one that I think the show is most interested in, the one that runs under everything, is about the possibility of genuine connection in a world that is optimized for managed interaction. Can you actually know someone in a world that rewards performance? Can you actually love someone in a world that prices attention? Can you actually be yourself in a world that responds to the curated version? The show's answer, I think, is with difficulty. With enormous difficulty. But yes, and the evidence it offers is the Watterson family, in all their unlovely, unperformable, genuinely loving chaos. They are the show's argument that something real can survive in the space that consumer culture and digital culture and internet culture leave behind. They are not winning. They are not optimized. They are not succeeding by any metric the world of Elmore takes seriously. But they're together, and they're something. I want to spend some time now on the show's handling of class, because it's part of the economic critique, and it doesn't always get discussed explicitly. The Wattersons are not wealthy. They're not desperately poor, but they're economically precarious in ways that come up throughout the show. There are episodes that explicitly deal with the family's financial situation, the car, the house, the budget. And the show depicts financial precarity with some accuracy. The way it shapes decisions, the way it creates constraints, the way it produces stress that gets displaced onto things that seem unrelated. What's interesting about the class dimension is how the show depicts the characters who have more resources. They're not depicted as villains, but they are depicted as operating in a different reality, one with more options, more buffer, more ability to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences. And the show is aware that this difference in reality shapes character. Not because richer people are better or worse people, but because the conditions of their lives allow different kinds of choices, different relationships to risk, different baseline assumptions about what's possible. This connects to something the show does with aspirational consumer culture. The selling of a particular version of the good life that depends on purchasing power that most of the show's target audience, and most of the Wattersons' demographic, doesn't actually have. The aspirational images are everywhere in Elmore. The things being sold are right there. And the gap between the aspiration and the reality is very real and very quietly depressing. The show sits in that gap and doesn't pretend it isn't there. Now let me take a different angle on the show and talk about something that I think often gets overlooked in discussions of its social commentary. The show's relationship to nostalgia and the past. Elmore is full of things that feel like they're from the wrong decade. references to older technology, older media, older cultural touchstones that coexist weirdly with completely contemporary ones. A character might reference a VHS tape in the same episode where they're navigating a fully realized internet. The chronological logic of the world is deliberately confused, and I think this confusion is intentional, and it's saying something about how we live now. We live in a permanently mediated relationship to the past. The internet has made every era equally accessible, so the cultural products of the 1980s and the 1990s and the 2000s are all equally present and equally available. Nostalgia used to be a feeling that had to wait. You had to actually be away from something for a while before you could feel nostalgic about it. Now, nostalgia is instantaneous and continuous. You can feel nostalgic for something while it's still happening. You can access the aesthetics of any past decade without having lived through it. Gumball represents this kind of temporally flattened cultural landscape. The visual styles are from everywhere and every when. The references are from across the entire history of animation and popular culture. And this flatness is not laziness or confusion. It's a portrait of what it's like to grow up in an information environment where everything is equally available and nothing is properly historical. One thing I find particularly interesting about this aspect of the show is how it relates to authenticity. Nostalgia, in its old form, was a way of accessing authenticity, the genuine memory of something experienced. Nostalgic objects and images carried the weight of actual experience. Now, nostalgic aesthetics are available to anyone, regardless of whether they have any connection to the original experience. You can have the vibe of the 1980s without the 1980s. You can have the aesthetic of childhood without the specific childhood that aesthetic came from. And this raises the question, is there still something real in the nostalgia? Or has it become entirely surface? The show sits with this question without answering it. It uses nostalgic aesthetics throughout. The older visual styles, the references to older cultural forms, while simultaneously being aware that these aesthetics are now divorced from the experiences that produce them. It's nostalgic about nostalgia, which is very contemporary. I also want to talk about what the show does with desire, because I think it's more interesting than it initially appears. Gumball wants things, constantly. He wants to be liked. He wants to be cool. He wants Penny to see him. He wants to be good at things he's not good at. He wants his father to be more present. He wants his mother to be less frightening. He wants to understand the world. He wants the world to be different from what it is. And the show takes these desires seriously. It doesn't mock Gumball for wanting. It follows the wants into their consequences and their complications. And what it tends to find is that the wanting is more valuable than the getting. That the state of wanting, the reaching toward, the engagement with the world that wanting requires, is actually a form of life. And that the getting, when it comes, tends to be smaller than the wanting promised. This is an old observation. The wanting is better than the having is one of the oldest insights in human culture. But the show comes at it from the particular angle of contemporary consumer culture, where the entire system is built on the premise that wanting should immediately produce getting, that the distance between desire and satisfaction should be minimized, that friction is a bug, and immediacy is the goal. Amazon delivers tomorrow. The app gives you the thing immediately. The streaming service starts the next episode automatically. Every friction in the desire to satisfaction pipeline has been identified and removed. And Gumball, by telling stories about wanting that don't resolve immediately, that have friction and delay and complication, is quietly making an argument for the value of that friction. The delay between wanting and getting is not waste. It's experience. It's the time during which you figure out what you actually want, as opposed to what you thought you wanted. It's the time during which you discover things you wouldn't have found if you'd gone directly from desire to satisfaction. The friction is the texture of a life being lived rather than consumed. This is, I know, a somewhat abstract point, but I think the show earns the abstraction because it's made of concrete moments. Every episode is a concrete moment of someone wanting something, and the wanting being more interesting than the getting. And across hundreds of episodes, those concrete moments accumulate into something that feels like a position, like a way of being in the world that the show is recommending. Now let me go back to the beginning, because I promised this would be a full circle, and we should close the loop. I started by asking you whether you'd ever felt that a piece of media was talking to you and not the children in the room. And I want to ask that question again, but differently, because having spent all this time with the show, I think the more interesting question is whether the children in the room were getting something different from the show. Not less than what the adults were getting, something different. Children experience satire differently. They don't have the framework to recognize what's being satirized, so they can't experience the satirical distance, the feeling of being above the thing being mocked. They experience it straight, and experiencing Gumball straight, without the satirical frame, gives you something really interesting. You get a vivid, funny, emotionally rich depiction of what the world is actually like for kids. The pressures are real. The confusion is real. The experience of being small in a world that was designed for other people and their needs is completely real. And the show validates that experience without condescending to it. So the children in the room are getting something true about their experience rendered with warmth and humor and respect. And the adults in the room are getting a critique of the systems that produce that experience. These are not the same thing, but they're not mutually exclusive. They're two frequencies being broadcast simultaneously. And depending on your receiver, you hear one or the other or both. That's a genuinely sophisticated achievement in media. That's what the great works of family entertainment have always done. Not condescend to children by giving them simple stories, but trust that complex stories can reach different people at different levels, and that the complexity is part of the value. Gumball is in this tradition. It's in the tradition of Pixar's better films, of early Simpsons, of certain episodes of Adventure Time and Gravity Falls and Steven Universe, but it's doing something more consistent and more politically specific than most of those comparisons. It's not just emotionally complex. It's ideologically complex. It has an argument to make about how the world is organized and who that organization serves. And it makes that argument every week, for 8 years, to an audience of children and their parents. And it makes it funny. There's a kind of optimism in the show that I want to name before we wrap up, because the show's darkness can sometimes be more visible than its hope, and I want to be fair to both. The optimism is this: Gumball and Darwin consistently choose connection. They consistently choose to engage with the world, and with each other, and with the people around them, even when that engagement is complicated, and risky, and results in disaster. They don't retreat. They don't optimize. They don't curate. They show up, imperfectly, and they try. And the show suggests that this is enough. Not enough to fix things. Not enough to change the systems that are causing the problems, but enough to be something real in a world that is constantly trying to make you into a surface. Enough to be a person rather than a persona. Enough to love and be loved in the genuine, embarrassing, unfiltered way that the show depicts as the Wattersons' defining characteristic. That's not a revolutionary political program. It's not a solution to any of the problems we've been discussing tonight, but it's something. It's a way of being in the world that the show recommends with real conviction. And I think that conviction comes through, even at 8 seasons of distance, even knowing that the show is fiction, and the town of Elmore is made of pixels, and the blue cat at the center of it never existed. The conviction is real. The feeling is real. The argument is real. And the argument is, you can be real too, even now, even in this world, especially in this world. The argument is also, and I want to be clear about this, that being real is not easy. The show is not naively optimistic. It's not telling you that authenticity is a simple state you can just decide to inhabit. It's telling you that authenticity is a practice, something you do, something you have to keep doing against the pressure of environments that reward the opposite. It's work, daily work, unglamorous work, the work of continuing to be a person when the incentive structures are all pointed toward becoming a surface. Gumball does this work imperfectly. He fails constantly. He gives into the pressure. He performs. He curates. He does the thing the machine wants. And then he comes home, and Darwin is there, and Aeneas is there, and Nicole and Richard are there, and something that doesn't optimize for anything happens. Something that couldn't be put on a menu, or turned into content, or liked, or shared, or monetized, or cited in a media literacy curriculum happens. It just happens. Between these specific people who love each other in this specific, unlovely, unglamorous way. And that's the show's final argument, that the specific is the antidote. The general is the machine. The general wants, the optimized desire, the curated persona. The specific is the person, the specific relationship, the specific afternoon, the specific joke that only these people find funny, the specific gesture that only means something between these two brothers who chose each other. The show is a hymn to the specific, and it sings it through 8 seasons of a blue cat making bad decisions and being loved anyway. Let me take one more broad pass over the show's legacy before I let you go, because I think it deserves to be placed in context. Gumball ended in 2019. In the years since, a lot of what it was satirizing has gotten significantly more extreme. Social media has become more enveloping. The attention economy has become more sophisticated at extracting engagement. Consumer culture has found new ways to colonize experience. The news environment has gotten more chaotic. Content creation has become a full-scale economy with professional structures and labor disputes and major platforms designed explicitly for its scale. Everything the show was pointing at has gotten bigger. And there's no season 9 coming. The show ended. But the archive is there, and it's interesting to go back to it with a few years of distance, because you can see what it was tracking in a way you couldn't when it was still happening. The show was keeping a record. Not a documentary record, it's still a cartoon about a blue cat, but a cultural record. A record of what it felt like to live through the first decade and a half of the smartphone era, the social media era, the always-on connectivity era, what the texture of that life was, what the anxieties looked like, what the jokes were. Future viewers, people watching this show in 10, 20, 30 years, will have a different relationship to it than we do. For them, it won't be prescient. It'll be historical. They'll watch it the way we watch social satires from the 1950s or 1960s and recognize the concerns as their ancestors' concerns. They'll be able to see what we couldn't see while we were inside it. But right now, watching it, some of it still lands as current. Some of it still lands as a description of this morning's experience. And that's remarkable. That's what happens when a piece of media makes observations that are precise enough and deep enough to outlast the specific cultural moment that produced them. I want to also spend a moment on what the show means for animation specifically, because I think its place in animation history is also interesting and underappreciated. For a long time, animation occupied a complicated cultural space. It was either prestige, the Disney model, serious storytelling with incredible craft, or it was disposable. Saturday morning cartoons, content for children that nobody expected to last, or matter, or mean anything beyond its immediate entertainment function. There wasn't much room between those poles. And the shows that tried to live in between those poles, shows with genuine satirical ambition, shows that took their own ideas seriously, often struggled to find their audience because the framing was wrong. You came to them expecting either art or junk and found something that didn't fit either category. Gumball found a third way. It was simultaneously clearly for children, genuinely, sincerely, not condescendingly for children, and clearly interested in ideas that children would not fully process. It didn't try to be prestige animation. It was too messy, too fast, too willing to be silly for the sake of being silly. But it wasn't disposable either. It had things to say, and it said them. And I think the show's legacy in animation is partly this. It demonstrated that a children's cartoon could have a genuine ideological project without becoming a lecture, could engage with contemporary cultural criticism without becoming earnest, could be funny without being empty. It expanded the vocabulary of what a children's cartoon could be. And the shows that have come in its wake, and there are several in various stages of development and production, are doing things that would have been harder to imagine without Gumball clearing some of the conceptual space. There's also something to be said about the show's production model and how it relates to its content. Gumball was made in the UK at Cartoon Network Studio in London, and this gives it a slightly different relationship to American consumer culture than a show made in the US would have. It's looking at American-style suburban consumer capitalism from a slight angle. It recognizes the forms, the mall, the suburb, the school, the media landscape, but it's not quite inside them. And that slight distance, that marginal outsider perspective, is part of what gives the satire its edge. You see things more clearly from slightly outside them than from deep within them. Ben Bacalé is French. The studio was British. The cultural object they were making was about an American-coded suburban environment, and the result is a piece of media that is simultaneously comfortable with and estranged from its subject, which is the perfect position for satire. Comfortable enough to render it accurately, estranged enough to see it clearly. The Amazing World of Gumball is one of those pieces of media. It made observations that were precise and deep. It made them funny. It made them kind. And it aimed them at children, which is both the bravest thing you can do with a political argument and the most effective. Because children are the ones who will be adults when the things the show was worried about fully arrive. And if the show did its job, they'll recognize the arriving thing. They'll have seen it before. In Elmore, in blue, and pink and orange. In a world where goldfish can grow legs and the internet can eat you alive. They'll know the shape of it. And maybe that recognition is the most useful thing a cartoon can give you. Not an answer. An eye. A way of seeing the shape of things. A set of tools for recognizing what's happening to you while it's happening. Gumball spent 8 years putting those tools in the hands of children, and they're still there, waiting. Before I get to some final thoughts, I want to circle back to something we touched on early and expand it in a direction I don't think we fully explored. The relationship between the show's mixed media visual style and its satirical project. Because I think this connection is more important than it might initially appear, and I've been wanting to come back to it. When you watch Gumball, you're watching characters who exist in fundamentally incompatible visual registers, share the same physical space, without any of them finding this strange. A character who looks like a clip art image from an early internet era stands next to a character rendered in sophisticated CG. Stands next to a character drawn in the style of a 1940s newspaper comic strip, and they all just talk to each other, interact, have relationships. The visual incompatibility is invisible to them. This is a very precise metaphor for what modern suburban life actually is. The suburb is full of things from completely different eras that somehow coexist without anyone remarking on the strangeness of it. The architectural styles are from different decades, and they sit next to each other on the same street. The cultural references in any given household span generations. The technologies people use range from things invented in the 1950s to things invented last year. The social values people hold are assembled from different historical moments, different class backgrounds, different cultural contexts. And all of this is somehow one neighborhood, one family, one person's daily experience. The show externalizes this internal heterogeneity. It makes visible, in animation terms, the kind of visual incoherence that we usually experience as the unremarkable texture of daily life. And by making it visible and exaggerated, it allows you to look at it, to notice the strangeness of living in a world assembled from incompatible pieces, to feel the dissonance that you usually walk right past. There's something genuinely important about this in the context of a show about modern consumer society, because one of the great achievements of consumer capitalism as a cultural project is the normalization of radical incoherence. The fact that everything we own comes from everywhere and was made under wildly different conditions and reflects wildly different value systems is invisible to us because we experience it as normal. The phone made by workers in conditions we'd find horrifying sits in a pocket next to a wallet containing money we earned doing something completely different, and we use both without the dissonance registering. The show's visual heterogeneity makes you feel a version of that dissonance. It puts the incompatible things in the same frame and makes you look at them. That's sophisticated. That's doing something that is genuinely hard to do in the medium of television, and Gumball does it naturally because it grew organically from its own production circumstances. Those rejected commercial mascots, that impulse to use whatever visual language was handy. But the result is a formal choice that does thematic work, whether or not the production process that produced it was consciously thematic. I also want to take a pass at one of the most interesting secondary characters in the show, someone who tends to get either overlooked or treated as comic relief, but who I think is doing something quietly significant. I'm talking about Miss Simeon, the school's long-suffering teacher. Miss Simeon is a cynical character. She's been teaching at Elmore Elementary for an extremely long time, The show implies she's been there for thousands of years, in the show's typically absurdist way, and she has concluded, through the accumulated weight of experience, that the students are essentially a problem to be managed, rather than people to be educated. She's not wrong, exactly, in a practical sense. The students are genuinely chaotic. They do make her job significantly harder. And her cynicism is, from a certain angle, wisdom. She has seen things. She knows how this usually goes. But the show is consistently critical of her cynicism, not because cynicism is never appropriate, but because her cynicism has calcified into something that prevents her from teaching well. She can't see the students as they are, because she has decided in advance what students are. The experience-hardened cynicism has become a filter that blocks the very information that might update it. She is, in this sense, the episode about media literacy made flesh. She is receiving the input of experience, but the format she's receiving it in, the students are the problem format, is determining what she can take from that input. And what Gumball does with her is interesting, and not entirely unsympathetic. The show doesn't make her a monster. It makes her someone who started out wanting to do something good, who got worn down by a system that didn't support her, and who found in cynicism a way to survive the gap between what she wanted to do and what she could actually do. That's a recognizable path. That's what happens to a lot of people in a lot of professions. The cynicism is protective. The cynicism is the scar tissue over the wound of disappointed hope. But the show is also saying, look at what the scar tissue costs. Look at what Miss Simeon can't see anymore because she's looking through the filter of disappointment. And look at what the students lose because of what she can't see. That's a small and specifically educational critique, but it connects to the larger theme about institutions and the people inside them. Institutions optimize for institutional survival. People inside institutions, over time, adopt the institution's optimization function as their own. And what gets lost in that process is sometimes the thing the institution was built to provide. The teacher who no longer believes in education, the news organization that no longer believes in truth, the platform that no longer believes in connection, the suburb that no longer believes in community. These are not malicious failures. They're structural ones, and the show finds them everywhere. Let me talk about one more secondary character who I think is doing significant work. Rob, the villain who appears in the later seasons. Without going too deep into the plot specifics, because some of you may not have gotten there, and I don't want to spoil the ride, Rob is a character who becomes aware of his own status as a background character in someone else's story, and is deeply, genuinely, philosophically damaged by this awareness. He has been given the kind of self-consciousness that reveals to him exactly how little he matters within the narrative logic of the world he inhabits. And his villainy comes from this awareness. He is not evil because he's bad. He is evil because he has discovered that the world's story is not about him, and he cannot accept this. Now, extend this outside the metatextual context of the cartoon. There is a specific kind of contemporary alienation. You see it in certain forms of online radicalization, in certain kinds of resentment politics, in the discourse around main character syndrome and its discontents, that comes from exactly Rob's problem. The discovery that the world is not organized around you, that you are not the protagonist of the story of modern life, that the world's systems and narratives and attention were designed for other people, for some implied center that you are not located at. And the response to this discovery can be the healthy one, adjusting your expectations, finding genuine connection and meaning on a smaller scale. Or it can be the Rob response, which is to try to force your way into the narrative through whatever means are available. The show is tracking a particular kind of discontent here that has become a significant feature of contemporary life. The person who was promised centrality and received marginality. The person who internalized the consumer culture's promise that they were the main character, the target demographic, the imagined user, the ideal customer, and then found that this promise was not honored. The person whose sense of themselves as the protagonist of their own life story is in constant conflict with a social and economic reality that does not confirm this self-image. Rob is the show's most intellectually ambitious character, I think, because he's engaging with these questions at the level of pure philosophical abstraction. He's not metaphorically discovering that he's a background character. He literally is one, and he knows it. And the show uses his literal situation to illuminate the metaphorical one that millions of people are living in. There's something generous in the show's treatment of Rob too. It doesn't despise him. It understands him. It understands the specific wound that produced him, and it takes that wound seriously even while it holds him accountable for the choices he makes in response to it. That combination, understanding and accountability, empathy and consequence, is the show's ethical template, applied here to a villain in a way that makes him more interesting than most cartoon villains get to be. One last thing I want to talk about before we reach the end for real this time. The show's relationship to love. Love is everywhere in Gumball. The show is saturated with it. Love between Gumball and Darwin, which is one of the most genuinely depicted brotherly friendships in the history of children's television. Love between Gumball and Penny, which is rendered with a sweetness and a seriousness that the show never makes fun of, even when it makes jokes around it. Love between the family members, each of whom loves the others in specific, particular ways that sometimes manifest as conflict and sometimes as support, and always as the consistent orientation of one person's concern toward another. And the show's interest in love is not separate from its social commentary. It's part of it. Because what the show is ultimately saying about consumer culture and digital culture and the attention economy is that these systems are bad at love. They're bad at the particular. They're designed for the aggregate, the average, the type. They're designed to address you as a demographic, as a user, as a customer, as a content consumer. And love, specific, particular, chosen, non-fungible love for this person, and not a person like them, is the thing that these systems cannot process or deliver. The family that the Wattersons are is not optimizable. It's not a good investment. It's not efficient. It produces terrible content. The moments of genuine family love are almost definitionally unfilmable because they're made of interior states and private knowledge and the accumulated history of people who have been through things together. They don't photograph. They don't go viral. They can't be monetized. They're just there, quiet and stubborn and specific, in the space that the systems can't reach. And the show is saying this space exists. Hold on to it. Even when the systems are everywhere, this space exists. Even when the menu is infinite and the algorithm is always watching and the news is always urgent and the scroll never stops, the specific love for the specific person in the specific moment is still possible, still real, still the thing that matters most. That's the show's deepest message, underneath all the satire and the formal innovation and the social commentary. It's a love story, not just Gumball and Penny. The whole show is a love story between the writers and the characters, between the show and the audience it was made for, between the creators and the genuine hope that something real can survive in the middle of everything that is not real. I believe them. And I think you, wherever you are tonight, probably do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. You don't spend quiet, late hours with something that doesn't matter to you. The fact that you're here, still listening, is itself a kind of answer to the question the show keeps asking. Can something real exist in the middle of everything that isn't? Yes, this is. Right now, this moment, whatever you're feeling, this is the specific. This is the particular. This is the thing the algorithm can't optimize and the menu can't include. That's worth something. More than a lot of things that we're trying harder to be worth something tonight. Hold on to that. Keep it somewhere the algorithm can't reach. It belongs to you and only you. And no one can take it, and no one can optimize it, and no one can put it on a menu. Let me talk for a moment about something that I think connects the show's social commentary back to the question of why we watch it. Why specifically we watch it like this. In the dark, late at night, in a state somewhere between consciousness and sleep. Because there's something interesting about the relationship between this kind of content and this kind of viewing state. Daylight viewing is defended viewing. You watch something in the daytime, and part of you is always a little guarded, a little ready to be bored, a little defensive against being moved, a little protected by the noise and activity of an ordinary day. Late night viewing is different. The defenses come down. The thing you're watching can get closer. And a show like Gumball, which is trying to get close, which is trying to show you something real underneath the animation and the comedy, benefits from the late night in ways that it wouldn't benefit from a Tuesday afternoon. I think there's something specifically right about letting Gumball talk to you in the dark, because the show's core project is about visibility. It's about showing you things that are easier not to see. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the half-dreaming state that this kind of video is designed to accompany, you're more permeable to things that want to be seen. The guard is down. The recognition can happen without resistance. So in a strange way, falling asleep to a video essay about social commentary might be the ideal way to absorb social commentary. Not the analytical, fully conscious, ready to debate absorption. The soft, permeable, it sinks in absorption. The kind that changes something without you being able to point to the moment of change. That's what the best of Gumball does too, I think. It changes something without you being able to point to the moment of change. You watch it, and you laugh, and you go about your life. And then at some point, maybe months later, maybe years later, you're in a situation, and you recognize the shape of it. And you know the shape, because you saw it once in a cartoon. And the recognition gives you a half second of clarity that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And in that half second, you make a slightly different choice. A slightly more considered choice. A choice that's a little less automatic. That's what good art does. Not dramatic transformation. Slight adjustments. The compound interest of small clarities. I want to go back to the episodes one more time. Not to retread the ground we've already covered, but to pull out a few specific moments that I think are worth sitting with individually. Because in a show this dense, there are always details that get lost in the broader discussion. There's a moment in the internet episode that I've been thinking about ever since I first saw it. After the video goes viral and the pile-on has happened, and Gumball is in the middle of the worst of it, there's a brief scene where he encounters one of the commenters in person, not online, in the actual world of Elmore, physically. And the commenter is completely unaware of what they've contributed to. They're not aware that there's anything to be aware of. They posted a comment and moved on, and it wasn't, from their perspective, a significant act. It was nothing. It was what you do. And Gumball is standing there, having experienced it as something, and the commenter has no idea. The gap between those two experiences, the gap between how significant the act was to the person receiving it, and how trivial it was to the person performing it, is the episode's sharpest insight. And it's an insight that's easy to access intellectually, but much harder to feel, because you're almost always on one side of the gap or the other. You're either the person for whom it was trivial, or the person for whom it was significant. And it's very hard to hold both perspectives at once. The show puts them in the same frame. Gumball and the commenter in the same physical space, looking at each other, and the commenter not knowing that they're looking at someone they hurt, and Gumball knowing everything. That image is still with me. The commenter's unknowing face. The gap in the room between two people who experienced the same event as two completely different things. There's also a moment in the boredom episode that I want to pull out. It comes near the end, after Gumball and Darwin have spent the day scrolling and consuming and arriving at that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from passive consumption rather than active engagement. And there's a moment where one of them, I'm going to let you rediscover which one, just stops, puts the device down, looks out a window, and doesn't do anything for a moment, just looks. The show gives this moment time, more time than you'd expect. It doesn't rush past it to the next joke. It lets you sit in the stillness of the moment with the character. And in that stillness, something happens. Not a dramatic something, not a breakthrough or a revelation, just the faint beginning of the interior life reasserting itself. The sound of your own thoughts, which you can only hear when you're not filling the space with input. The show doesn't caption this moment. It doesn't explain it. It just shows it, and then it moves on. But I've thought about that moment more than almost any other moment in the show, because it felt like being given permission. Permission to stop. Permission to sit with the stillness instead of escaping it. Permission to hear yourself. I also want to spend a moment on the menu episode's ending, because I think the show earns it. After the entire saga of the infinite menu and the paralysis and the escalation, there's a resolution that I'm not going to describe in detail, because it's better experienced than summarized. But what it does is wonderful. It resolves the problem, not by fixing the menu or defeating the restaurant, but by making an entirely different kind of choice. A choice that opts out of the menu's logic entirely. A choice that the menu doesn't have a category for. And the show is saying, this is always an option. The system will always have categories for certain kinds of choices, but the categories don't exhaust the possible choices. There are always moves that the system hasn't anticipated. And the move that gets you out of the infinite menu is not the move that the menu rewards. It's the move that the menu can't process. That's a small revolution. A tiny, laughing, cartoon revolution that happens in a restaurant in a fictional suburb. But the shape of it is real. Let me also talk about something the show does in the news episode that I glossed over earlier. There's a sequence in the episode where the family watches the news together, and the watching itself is interesting. The family is not actively engaged. They're not discussing what they're seeing, not questioning it, not bringing their own knowledge to bear on it. They're receiving. They're in the passive mode that television watching, more than any other media experience, tends to produce. And the show is very deliberate about depicting this passive mode, because the passive mode is part of the problem. You can't be media literate in passive mode. Media literacy is an active skill. It requires you to do things, to question, to verify, to think about what you're not being shown as well as what you are. And the family watching the news in Elmore is not doing those things, not because they're not capable of doing them, but because the format doesn't invite them to. The news anchor speaks with authority. The graphics are authoritative. The music is authoritative. The whole environment says, receive. Don't question. Just receive. And the family receives. And they are exactly as informed afterward as the news intended them to be, which is to say, they feel informed. They have absorbed emotional content, and they are oriented toward the world in exactly the way the broadcast intended. Whether this orientation bears any relationship to the actual state of the world is, the episode suggests, somewhat beside the point for the purposes of the broadcast. The show is not saying the news is lying. It's saying the news is operating with a different definition of success than you might assume. The news defines success as audience engagement and return viewership, not as accurate understanding of the world. Those two definitions of success sometimes produce the same content. Sometimes they don't. And the news doesn't always make it obvious when they diverge. There's one more thing I want to say about the show's politics before we really do close out. And it's something that I think is important and that often gets missed in discussions of the show as social satire. The show is not cynical. I want to be very clear about this because it would be easy to read the social commentary as cynicism, as a show that looks at the world and sees through it and finds it wanting. But Gumball is not cynical. Cynicism is a protective posture. It's the stance of someone who has decided that nothing is worth hoping for, so they won't hope so they can't be disappointed. Cynicism is comfortable. It asks nothing of you. Gumball is not comfortable. Gumball keeps hoping. Gumball keeps caring about things. Gumball keeps showing up imperfectly and being hurt by the showing up and showing up again anyway. And the show treats this not as stupidity or as naivety, but as a form of courage. The courage to remain open to disappointment, because remaining open to disappointment is the only way to remain open to genuine joy. That distinction between cynicism and hope that has been tested matters a lot to me. I think some of the most important art of the contemporary period is art that has looked at the world honestly, has seen the problems, understood the systems, refused the comfortable escape of false hope, and then decided to keep caring anyway. Not because caring will fix everything, because caring is the only thing worth doing with a life, even in a world that is frequently indifferent to the caring. Gumball is that kind of art. It's looked at the world honestly. It hasn't flinched from what it sees, and it keeps caring. Through Darwin, through Nicole, through the Penny storyline, through every episode where something goes wrong and someone tries anyway. And in the middle of whatever complicated, pressured, noisy, optimized to death world you're inhabiting right now, I find that kind of hope genuinely useful. Not as an instruction, as a reminder. A reminder that the caring is still an option. That the staying open is still an option. that the blue cat keeps trying. That's what we've been doing tonight, in a quieter way. Taking the tools out and looking at them. Turning them over in our hands and seeing what they're for. And maybe, on some nights, this is the best use of the late hours. Not scrolling, not consuming, but sitting with something that was made with thought and care and a genuine desire to tell the truth and letting it do its work. The truth doesn't always have to arrive loud. It doesn't always have to come at you with urgency. Sometimes it comes slowly, in the dark, through the voice of a cartoon about a blue cat in a suburb. And it says, look at what you're inside. Look at how it's shaped. Look at the walls. You don't have to tear them down tonight. You don't have to solve anything. Just look. And then you can sleep. And tomorrow, maybe, you'll see things a little differently. Taking the tools out and looking at them. Turning them over in our hands and seeing what they're for. And maybe, on some nights, this is the best use of the late hours. Not scrolling, not consuming, but sitting with something that was made with thought and care and a genuine desire to tell the truth and letting it do its work. The truth doesn't always have to arrive loud. It doesn't always have to come at you with urgency. Sometimes it comes slowly, in the dark, through the voice of a cartoon about a blue cat in a suburb. And it says, look at what you're inside. Look at how it's shaped. Look at the walls. You don't have to tear them down tonight. You don't have to solve anything. Just look. And then you can sleep. And tomorrow, maybe, you'll see things a little differently. I've been talking for a long time. Longer than any of these subjects deserve in a single sitting. And simultaneously, not nearly long enough. There are episodes we didn't get to. There are arguments we only touched. There are whole seasons of material that deserve their own deep dives. But that's what future videos are for. That's what subscribing is for. So that the next time I go long and slow and deep into a cartoon that deserved more credit than it got, you'll be there. If you're still awake at this point, I'm impressed and also slightly concerned for your sleep schedule. If you drifted off somewhere around the part about Byung-Chul Han and Achievement Society, that's genuinely ideal, and I hope you had good dreams. If you're reading this from a transcript because you fell asleep before you could finish it, welcome back. You chose the best way to experience a long video essay. The world is complicated. The shows that helped us understand it are worth celebrating, and worth examining closely, and worth spending quiet nights with. Gumball was one of those shows. It earned its place in the conversation. And I'm glad we got to have this conversation. Wherever you are, whatever brought you here tonight, I hope the night is gentle. I hope the sleep, when it comes, is the deep and dreamless kind. I hope tomorrow morning feels a little more manageable than tonight. And I hope that the next time you watch something, anything, a cartoon or a drama or a news broadcast or a TikTok or whatever the thing is, you bring a little of what we talked about tonight. A little of the eye. A little of the recognition. You've been listening to Cortoon. We'll be back. And in the meantime, if you found your way here through the algorithm, through the very machine the show is critiquing, maybe that's the most fitting way to arrive. The machine brought you to something that tells the truth about the machine. There's a certain poetry in that. A blue cat's revenge. Gumball wins in the end, after all. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.